Thank you, Madam Speaker. So first thing I'm going to do in this speech is break down everything you've just heard from the government. And second, I'm going to go into the third constructive point on the opposition side. All right. So I'll go through the points that Kathleen just brought to you and show you exactly why they really don't hold true. So first of all, she said, well, there may be some harms, but we can help lots of people anyway. And I mean, that's sort of a given. In any case, you're obviously going to have some people benefiting and some harms. But what we're really discussing here is the balance between those harms versus the people that you help. And so just because asserting that there are people you help doesn't mean that that actually outweighs the harms. And so we see that the government has failed to address this balance itself, whereas on the opposition side, we presented you that the harms will be greater because we don't know how to deal with what we're meddling with. Life is super complicated. Genomes are huge. And if we start combining parts that would never naturally have come together, we can't predict the effects. And we know historically that's resulted in massive global disasters. Sure, you might help a few people down the road, but let's not kill them all from another cause when it's completely possible to avoid that eventuality. So it's not like we have to do this model to get these benefits. We can absolutely get these benefits. We just have to wait maybe a few years longer. And to defend that, I'll bring up the status quo. We currently have a lot of regulations on what we can and can't do. I mean, right now we limit stem cell research a little bit, and yet we're still seeing massive medical progress. It's not like we're bringing science to a standstill at the status quo. We're simply taking it slowly, and it still works. All right, now she's also alluded to this idea that knowledge is somehow an intrinsic good, that we can learn from pony monkeys. And yet I'd argue, in our society, we already have knowledge that we keep secret from individuals. What about knowledge about how to make nuclear weapons? Knowledge about how to make biochemical weapons? Knowledge about how to make agents that can hurt other individuals? Knowledge about how to make bombs? All these things we keep secret in our society. So our society recognizes that this knowledge is not an intrinsic good. Now, developing new techniques to make crazy genetically modified things may very well fall into the same category of dangerous knowledge. We can see that you can directly engineer an organism to take on the properties of the polio virus or of Ebola virus and use that as a biochemical weapon to infect someone else. And so we see, especially as it becomes easier to do genetic modification, people can now do it in their garages for $1,000 or so, that we need to have regulations that keep pace with the technology that makes it easier. And so as I'll take you in a second, there's increasing risk of using this knowledge for harm and developing more knowledge that could lead to more harmful practices. We need to regulate this knowledge. Thank you.
If people can do this in their garage, isn't one of the best ways of stopping them from preventing this is being able to have researchers who can keep pace with what is coming out of the garages of our society and prevent it from hurting people?
Okay, so we have an option. If there's something nasty we may do with it, should we say, let's do it, but let's catch up later, or let's just say, make sure they don't do it? I mean, it's a lot easier to prevent it in the first place than to try and catch up with it later. Let's just say no and make sure that people don't do this in garages instead of trying to fight them later once they've already developed it and can kill us with their crazy E. coli. All right, so the next thing that she mentioned was, well, we don't have to do what everyone says. Well, if there's some people in our democracy who don't believe it, too bad for them. Well, that may be fine if it only affects an individual. Like what I choose to do with my person, if it only affects my person, then I can do something that you may disagree with, as long as it only affects me. But as soon as what I do affects you, then I have to take into account what you would think of it. There's a lot of precedent in society that the government limits your freedoms as soon as it starts to infringe on someone else's freedoms. Like if you shout fire in a crowded theater and everyone gets stampeded, that would clearly be a bad thing, even though you have this right to freedom of speech. And so we have this case where the right of the scientist to have this freedom of exploration is limited by the opinions of others. And as I did point out in the POI, the money that funds this research is pretty much from taxes. And so all these different opinions are contributing to this research, and researchers must be held accountable to what the general population thinks. All right. She mentioned, well, animal rights, let's minimize their pain. It still doesn't address the question that with the kind of advances we're having now, we can actually create life in the near future. We can totally redesign their genome. And so it's not just a matter of animal suffering. It's about what's our relationship to the existence of an animal. All right. And we see that as we start to deal with that, if we take on that role, we take on a great responsibility to care for our creations. If we bring this organism, this new creation, this pony monkey into existence, what kind of responsibility do we have for this? And I'd argue that scientists are not equipped to deal with that responsibility. If you've ever read Frankenstein, the creator of Frankenstein feels this huge responsibility to sort of care for Frankenstein, and he goes kind of crazy because he realizes that caring for this monster, even though he has a moral obligation to care for him, still creates a monster in society. So in that 5-minute speech, you just heard exactly why all the points on the government fall. And with that said, I'm just going to mention one more point on our opposition, and that is the role of the state. We've mentioned that this point is really summarizing all of what we've heard so far, which is why it's a wonderful thing to save to last. All right, so what is the role of the state then? Well, it's to make the decisions that are best for our society. And this ties exactly into my point about, well, we have this plurality in our society, and we must respect them. So this question now is, what is the agent to make sure that scientists respect all these viewpoints in our society? And that agent is the government, because it's been elected to represent these people and so has the jurisdiction to say, this is what people think. All right. The role of the state. What about, well, we've already brought up in our arguments, well, is knowledge necessarily good? Kathleen argues that it is, and we see lots of examples where knowledge is hidden. And so which agent is the one that decides what knowledge is good and is not? I'd argue again that it is the state, and therefore the state has this ability to constrain genetic modification. Because the state can recognize that so many people can use this for such negative purposes that this knowledge is something that has to be kept under lock and key, at least to some extent. All right. And the last thing that I'll mention with the role of the state is prevention. Now, this has also been a big theme in our debate, where Kathleen's been saying, well, let's wait till it happens and we can deal with it later. We can fix it later and we'll help people later. Whereas we're saying here, let's just not have this problem in the first place. Let's not let these people do genetics in their basement and make bioweapons in the first place. Let's just not allow it. And so, does the government have this ability to prevent these things in the first place? There's lots of precedents where the government says, no, you shouldn't even try this. There's lots of regulations on what chemical reactions you can do, what you can import, what you can outport, all these examples. So what have I shown you so far today? We've had these two strong points in the opposition, where locking stuff up doesn't work. She's really said, well, there are some benefits anyway, but that doesn't outweigh the harms. We've had this point about the social consequences, where people disagree with this, and we have an obligation to listen. And she said, well, too bad for them. And we have this third point that ties it all together about the role of the state, which I'm curious to see what she'll say about. Whereas on the government side, we see that their points of safety we've shown you is unsafe because you're bringing together so many new combinations that you don't understand. It's lack of understanding that can lead to so many problems in the future. She has this point of, like, knowledge is good, but we see knowledge can also be used for great evil and has been restricted in our society in many instances. And this whole public responsibility for public good, well, we're already getting good out of science by taking it slowly. We can still have these benefits. Let's just not bring greater harms with them by rushing into it too fast. And so ultimately this debate has come down to a benefits versus harms analysis. And we argue strongly on the opposition that the harm just based upon the opinions of people that we are going to be violating, the right of people to have their own opinion that we're going to be violating, the lack of understanding that we don't know what the consequences will be, all warrant that the state should intervene and say that genetic modification of life is not permissible. For these many reasons, we beg to oppose. Thank you.
Not for the Republic.